So yes, I'm now recording, and the only advantage of doing video is if you wanted to do any screen sharing for visual aids, if we wanted to write out any arguments or something like that, then we could do that. But if you don't need to do that, that's okay.
No, I'm fine without that. I'm going to be verbal today.
Okay, great. Well, first of all, I just want to thank you again for taking the time to chat with me. And yeah, it's an honor to be able to talk with you about these things.
I'm glad to be able to work with you and to encounter you again. I guess our paths crossed in the distant past there. I write all day. I've been writing since approximately 3 this morning. So the very last thing I want to do is crank out another 1,000 or 2,000 words. But talking doesn't have that same feel to it.
Sure, I totally understand. I feel like I read all day.
Yeah.
And so, at least at this point in my academic career, so I'm glad to have a break from reading. So, so just for the record, I guess you are a professor of philosophy at my alma mater at Wright State University, and you've been a professor for quite some time.
Since 1983.
You did your doctoral work at UCLA, is that right?
Yes, that's right.
Okay. And you have focused in your career on a number of things, but it seems like your primary interest has to do with Stoicism.
At present, well, I have a number of interests, but that would be the theme by which I'm best known would be Stoic philosophy.
And you describe yourself as a practicing Stoic.
Yes.
So it is personally meaningful to you.
Yes.
Great. Well, and you would also describe yourself as an atheist. Is that accurate?
I think agnostic would be a better description of it. I mean, it depends on what day you ask me, but I suppose if I literally, if somebody said, "Can you prove a view?" I'd have to say that there's a long shot chance that a God exists. But so I guess I've been labeling myself as an agnostic in recent years.
Okay. Is that a shift from when you were younger?
Yeah, and one of the things that did it is I've been seeing all of these really noisy atheists, who are now going around blasting Christianity. And I understand that Christianity can make a huge difference, a huge positive difference in people's lives. I've seen it in other people, and I certainly don't want to scoff at them. But if they're also making a specific claim about the existence of God, then I don't think the evidence is there, which is one of the things we're going to be talking about today.
Sure. Okay, well, you had mentioned, I asked you via email if you could pick maybe one or two reasons that you reject Christian faith. And if I understand what you said, the two things that you mentioned were number one, among all of the major world religions, or perhaps the plausible world religions, Christianity does not seem special in terms of the evidence that it offers. And then you had also mentioned the problem of evil.
Yeah, those would be the big two reasons I would have against becoming, or at least to say that Christianity has not made its case. If their claim is rather than simply a philosophy to live by, if their claim is that this is God's chosen religion, then I have problems with that.
Okay. Well, it may be that we have time to look at both of those issues, but if we can, I'd like to start with the problem of evil.
Sure.
How would you articulate that issue in your own words and in terms of the problem that it presents for you?
Well, according to the problem of evil, if God is described as being omniscient, omnipotent, and perfectly good, then there are real problems with the world we see around us, because of a being who had those characteristics could not conceivably have created the world we see.
Okay. Um, so I don't know when the last time you brushed up on some of the literature and the problem of evil was, but are you familiar with the distinction between the logical and the evidential problem?
Well, I haven't done a lot of reading since the 1980s, so yes, I'm very dim on the exact literature and the way people are going to be dividing up the arguments.
Okay. Well, if I can, let me just sort of review two ways that the argument has historically been presented, and then you can, if one of those resonates with you more particularly, then maybe we can focus on that particular version. Um, the logical problem of evil is it may be a little bit older than the evidential problem of evil, and it would suggest that there is a logical incoherence with the very concepts of God and the concept of evil. And so someone who thinks that there is a logical problem of evil would suggest that Christianity is, or even theistic belief in general, is internally incoherent in that, and here's kind of how it would typically go. An all good and all powerful God would not allow evil to exist. That's kind of premise one. But yet, evil exists, premise two. And then the conclusion would be, therefore, an all good and all powerful God does not exist because these things logically are incompatible.
Let me pause you.
Sure.
Let me pause you there. An all-powerful and perfectly good and all-knowing being, I would say, might allow evil to exist, but not nearly to the extent that it does. So I don't know if that moves us out of the logical argument or not.
Sure. It may. The evidential problem is that may be approaching more the evidential problem, and the evidential problem would basically be saying that be conceding that an all-powerful, all-good being may allow evil to exist, but there are instances of evil that just appear to be over the top or gratuitous. And yes, maybe God could allow for evil to exist, but why so much evil?
Right. And another distinction there is the difference between man-caused evil and natural evil. So a man, you could make the case that God is a good parent, and a good parent knows that for you to prevent all bad things from happening to your child is bad for the development of the child, that you should allow the child to make mistakes and learn from those mistakes. And I can imagine God taking a similar approach with us, except that some of the mistakes we make, we can't learn from because they're fatal mistakes. And of course, when a tsunami kills 250,000 people, it's just not clear that same line of reasoning works.
Sure. Okay. So you're actually okay with the idea that there can be a good reason for some amount of suffering or even moral evil.
Yes, I agree.
Okay. Well, if we were to look at that, sort of this version of the objection, this evidential objection, if I may try to formalize it, and you can tell me if you agree or disagree with this articulation of the basic problem. Premise one would be that there are instances of evil and suffering which appear to be gratuitous. Premise two, if there are instances of gratuitous evil and suffering, then there is no all good and all powerful God. And then premise three, this is sort of a probabilistic argument. Therefore, most probably there is no all good and all powerful God.
Okay, what do you mean by gratuitous? What is your definition of that? I don't need an exact definition, but just nudge me along to what you're thinking about.
I think what gratuitous would mean here would be that there really is no morally sufficient reason to have allowed it to happen.
Okay, so I'm thinking of cases like this. So what I'm doing is recreating lectures I give to my students. But God can allow us to do evil things. God can allow us to lift a gun, get a gun, point a gun at somebody, pull the trigger, and God can, of course, cause the results to be less than fatal. God can easily do that, and yet God chose not to do that. So I would call that gratuitous evil in the sense that God certainly had it in his power to prevent that angry act from resulting in death, and yet God chose not to. So is that what you would have in mind by gratuitous evil?
Well, yeah, as long as you believe that it's gratuitous, I think that or at least that it appears to be gratuitous, I think that would be enough for to make it a problem for you.
Okay, let's work along those lines. So why is that a problem for me?
Well, it's from what you're saying, it seems to be a problem for you because you can't make sense of what good could come out of that would justify allowing it to happen.
Well, it can't be to teach a lesson to the person who is dead, because the person is dead now, right?
That's right.
So maybe somebody else can pick a lesson, but it seems like the lessons we could get, there are ways to get them without people, suffering terrible deaths and so on. But if there were some kind of lesson, profound lesson, then yeah, then you'd kind of have me there. But the other thing is, God, being all powerful, can make our world dramatically different. He could make a world without disease. He could make a world without lethal weapons. He could make sure everybody has enough to eat. It's a classic thing. He's got so much power. It'd be like a parent who was letting his kids starve
Sure.
when he had it in his power to do otherwise.
Okay. Well, let me see, kind of come at this from two different angles to see how you would respond to these responses. The first, I guess, would be a question, and it would be simply that is it possible that what appears to be gratuitous to us only appears gratuitous and it's actually not?
Yep.
Or in other words, is it possible that God has a good reason for allowing these events to play out like they do, and we simply don't know what it is?
Could be, but you can also say that of somebody who pulls out a gun and shoots down a stranger in a restaurant. It could be that they have deep and profound and moral reasons for what they do, and yet the interesting thing is we typically don't cut them any slack for doing that. So it is possible that they have a reason, and yet in most of life, that's not enough for us. We instead feel that isn't going to get them off the hook.
Yeah.
And whatever reasons God could have, I mean, suppose he says, I had to let that evil happen in order to prevent a plague that I know would descend on earth. Otherwise, if I didn't let that evil happen, hey God, you can prevent the plague. You can just snap your fingers or whatever it is, and it goes away. So it's a lot harder for him to come up with a compelling reason for letting evil happen.
Okay. Well, in your analogy with the person coming into a restaurant and shooting someone, I agree with you. It would be certainly it's possible that they might have an explanation or a rationale or some justification, but it would have to be incredibly convincing, and it would have to be a really good justification.
I would say that about God too. So if you gave me a justification for God, that would be very interesting. I'd be willing to hear such things. But like I say, it's going to be really hard for God to get off the hook because he has so much power. All powerful. That's as much as you can have.
Sure. Well, I think I would like to move in that direction. That is, as you know, or may remember if, from the literature that you have read in the past, that's sometimes called a theodicy,
Yeah.
a justification for God. And I think that we can offer some some theodicies, and so if we can kind of bookmark that and come back to it. But before we do, I think with that analogy, one issue with that analogy is that another human being is basically a peer to us. And so we know what it means to be human. We know what humans need. We know how humans think. We know what is permissible, basically, for humans. But God is not a peer. The difference between us and God, if God did exist, would be very, very extreme. And one imperfect analogy would be kind of the difference between a very small child and a parent. But the difference between us and God is even more extreme than that. But, if you can imagine a situation where parents would allow their children to undergo what appears to them to be serious evil, that they simply cannot understand why. For example, if a child is potentially terminally ill or has some chronic illness and the parents subject them to very painful medical treatment that the child simply doesn't understand and is not able to understand, the parents certainly do have a good justification, but the child at the point that he's at in life simply couldn't understand it.
Yeah, so it could be that there is a profound reason we just aren't up to speed intellectually in various terms to understand what that should be. Still, I guess I would love to hear a description of that. And while we're on that thought, this might be a sidetrack, which we don't have to go down. But it has always seemed utterly strange to me that God, an infinitely powerful, all-knowing being, would have created us in the first place. And if he created us so we could be worshipful of him, that's just bizarre. That would be like me saying, you coming over and realizing I had 15 kids, in my family, that I had created all these kids. And you said, well, why did you do that? I guess you really love kids. And suppose I said, no. I wanted to be worshipped by these kids and for them to respect me and look up to me and do what I tell them. And I punish them if I don't. That would be a really strange sort of relationship. We could understand it in a human because we're flawed in so many respects, but in God, if he's perfectly good, it's just hard to imagine that. But that might be a side trip, and I'll leave it to you whether we go down that or not.
Well, I think that may tie into one of the theodicies that I will offer.
Okay.
So let me make a note of that, and maybe we can come back to that. So basically what you're saying there is you think it's strange that God would desire worship at all.
Yeah.
Okay. I'm just going to make a note. Okay, and that I think will come back up when we talk about some theodicies that I'll suggest. But before I go there, another response I would make to what you've said is that we know what evil God has allowed to occur, at least partially. I'm sure no one knows exhaustively the evil that God has allowed to occur. So we only know that partially. What we certainly don't know is all of the evil that God has not allowed to occur. And so from our vantage point, it could seem that God has allowed for too much evil to occur, too much to be justified. But how do we know, in light of the fact that we don't know all of the things that God has prevented or all of the ways that he actually has curbed evil? I mean, I guess to offer an analogy, it's kind of like, I'm sure, you deal with college students, and I'm sure that you have interacted with students or interact with them all the time who think that things are really bad in their life because they're going through some difficult circumstances. And it could be that they certainly are going through difficult circumstances, but they just really lack a perspective on how hard life can be and what other people are going through. And relatively speaking, what they're going through really isn't all that difficult. And if they could gain a perspective on how bad things actually could be, that they might have a better perspective on what they're actually suffering. How would you respond to that?
I would say that an all-powerful, all-knowing God could make things a lot better than they were. So humans are limited by their knowledge, by their understanding, by their power to do things. So for humans, it's okay to give the answer that, hey, I'm doing the best I can. I'm only human, is what they would say. God can't give a parallel kind of justification. So it seems like he's stripped of that. You could also ask the question about why he created the universe at all. He would have known how it was going to turn out, and if it's going to turn out to be a flawed universe with the people he creates within it, and that was another choice on his part, having to live in that flawed universe, he might have said, you know what, let's not even do it then. Let's not have a physical universe.
Sure. Well, I mean, I guess kind of the point that I'm trying to make there is that you are saying you can imagine God allowing for a certain amount of evil because you can see good results coming from a certain amount, but you think the problem is there's just way too much. Too much to be justified, and different kinds of evil that seem unjustified. And
by the way, that is a good way to encapsulate the argument that I'm giving. So we're on the same track as far as that goes.
okay. So my question is, in light of what if it's just that we lack perspective? What if, for example, I remember you saying this in class once. You were talking about some of the, even though you, as far as I know, you don't practice prayer. You could imagine, and you're confused about some issues related to prayer, like why would we ask God to? I forget exactly what issues you had with prayer, but one of the things you said about prayer that you appreciated was the aspect of thanksgiving, and that if we give thanks at a meal, it causes us to appreciate even the smallest blessings that much more. I remember you saying something like that. Do you remember?
The standard lecture is, I don't understand. Um, they have times when they'll say, everybody pray for something, as if enough do it, that the message will get through to God. But a single individual doesn't even have to pray because God knows what he's thinking, which is an interesting thought. I am big on prayers of thanks. I think in general we should be very thankful to be here to live in the world that we're living in, and that makes it a lot more tolerable. That a world without evil, a world without the possibility of dying, would be a worse world because we would likely take everything for granted. So some evil is probably a good thing in getting us to appreciate the world. But, and this was what, the 2004 Boxer Day tsunami came in, killed 250,000 people. And then it just boggles the imagination of, okay, so could God have prevented that? Yep. And if he couldn't have prevented it, he could have warned people. He could have said from on high, hey, people, this is God. Head for higher land. He didn't do that. It just boggles the imagination why he would have let that happen.
Sure. Okay. I appreciate that. Well, let's move to start talking about some theodicies a little bit. And these would be some suggestions. I mean, I guess my basic response to kind of conclude our initial discussion of the problem, my basic response to the problem would be that I think that we're assuming that just because something looks gratuitous, that it is gratuitous. And furthermore, that we are, if that argument is persuasive to us, I think it's because we're already assuming that God could not have a morally sufficient reason for allowing all the evil that he does. And I would question the legitimacy of those assumptions. that would be kind of my final word on the basic problem, and then you're free to respond to that.
Okay, see, my thing is, well, at least hint at what it could be. You don't have to give me detailed kind of explanation of what it is that forces him to allow not just some evil, but as much evil as he does. Um, Give me a hint, throw
Sure.
it on my
Okay.
way,
Well,
because
we could,
it boggles the imagination,
yeah,
and it's an interesting double standard, because if a human being told us that, we would say, come on now. And if he said, oh no, it's because I'm so much smarter than you are, and I know so much, and you can't even imagine what it is, we wouldn't say, yeah, I guess then, we ought to give you the benefit of the doubt. But you're asking a being who would have much less justification for doing it, because he is perfect and all knowing and all good. We're saying give him the benefit of the doubt, which I need to be thrown a bone, because
okay.
otherwise it's just like, no, I'm not going to trust. If you're a
Sure.
Christian,
I
the
think that's
idea of
fair.
trusting God is it's in your bones, right? That's in your blood. The idea that you should trust God. And so when God says, yeah, trust me, I got deep reasons for what I do, that might satisfy you. But if you're out of the loop, like I am, an agnostic, then the question is, well, why should I trust him?
Sure. I think that's fair. And I do think that we should recognize that the existence of suffering and evil is boggling, and it is a serious problem. And I really actually don't believe that even I don't think that any Christian can give a completely satisfying answer, because I don't think that the Bible itself gives a completely satisfying answer, and it, sort of intentionally. I mean, this as I don't know if you remember the book of Job, or when the last time you looked at that, but that's probably the first um, book that was written in Scripture. It's probably the oldest book in the Old Testament, and it concerns the problem of evil. And at the end of the day, it doesn't really, Job is wondering why all of these terrible things are happening to him, and he doesn't really get an answer.
Yeah, it's I am aware of it. It's deeply um, disturbing for a number of reasons. And the last time I talked about it in class, see, the interesting thing is that first thing is God is there, and the devil is present, and my first reaction is, get him, God, you know, lock him up. And oh, by the way, God, why didn't you destroy him rather than simply removing him from heaven? But I had a student this last time. This is something I hadn't heard, that it wasn't the devil at all. Who was it? It says God in the book of Job. God is talking to who?
In the angelic council in the book of Job,
Yeah,
the Hebrew word is hasatan, and it means the adversary.
yeah.
Um,
Okay,
yeah,
so there's a possibility that this isn't the devil, or whatever we mean by the devil, that this is something else going on. But then, the other paradox there is at the end. Um, the question is Job in it just to keep on God's good side? And so, God doesn't help Job, and then finally, when Job passes all these tests, God rewards Job for having done, for having suffered so much on God's behalf. So it's a curious thing where, I say I'm not going to reward him, but then at the end, he gets the reward.
yeah, he is rewarded, and the answer. I mean, Job's friends, his counselors who come to him, basically their uh, counsel to Job is that the reason that he's suffering is because he must have done something wrong. It must be some sin, and God is judging him. And if he can just discover what it is or acknowledge what it is, then all of this will go away. And Job keeps insisting that no, I haven't done anything wrong, and he keeps appealing to God for an answer. Why is all of this happening? And at the end of the day, God rebukes everyone. He rebukes Job's friends because they were being presumptuous and they were wrong. Job wasn't suffering because of his own wickedness. And then God also rebukes Job, which is kind of, I think, for modern people, the really frustrating part because he doesn't give Job an answer. But he really kind of exerts his sovereignty. And kind of the answer of the book is, I'm God and you're my creature, and where were you when I laid the foundation of the earth? Don't I have a right to do what I want?
Yep, and that's just a very Old Testament ring to it. We have a vengeful God. I have a hard time respecting the God of the Old Testament. Um, he seems to have major personality issues, and if he's a human, okay, that's how we are because we're limited. But he's unlimited. Um, and if you go back to the Garden of Eden, I have attempted to read large parts of the Bible at various times, but like the Garden of Eden, I keep stopping and saying, what is going on here? And then the idea that we would be punished for the sins of Adam and Eve, that just is contrary to any notion of justice. I mean, I wasn't there. It was a distant ancestor. And but now, of course, there's this different sense in saying we aren't really being punished. It's I'm not quite sure how it works, but it becomes complicated, but I'm trying to understand all of this from a basic human, non-Christian point of view, not an anti-Christian point of view, but I'm trying to put things when we talk about justice and we talk about goodness. I think about human goodness, and then I try to think, okay, so if that's what we expect of mere flesh and blood mortals, what should we expect of a God who knows everything and can do anything and is perfectly good? It's a pretty high bar that you set when you talk that way.
Sure. Well, let me begin to unpack a few suggestions as to why God may allow certain instances of evil. And I think that we can only ever there have been a lot of attempts at theodicies, and there have been attempts that I think go way beyond what the Bible says. The ones that I'm going to offer, I'm going to try to limit to what Scripture itself says, so I don't want to presume to know why God might do what he does aside from what the Bible itself says. So my theodicies are kind of limited to that. And then another caveat is I think we can only ever give partial theodicies or partial explanations in that. So these are things that, sorry, I have some notes here. I'm going to pull this up. Partial theodicy would be a morally sufficient rationale that we can imagine would explain evil in some instance, but maybe it's not going to work for every instance.
Okay.
And so here's an example of one partial theodicy, which has a limited use, but I do think in some situations it is useful. There are times in Scripture where we see that God allows evil in order to punish wickedness. And so, as an example, God allowed the Babylonians to destroy the southern kingdom of Judah and carry them off into exile because his people were idolatrous and unfaithful to him. And the explanation, and it actually does create this sort of problem of evil. If you read the book of Habakkuk, Habakkuk is this prophet who's seeing all of this happen, and he sees the wickedness of his own people, and he prays to God, and he says, God, how could you have allowed this to happen, and aren't you going to do anything? Or my people no longer worship you? And God responds to Habakkuk, and he says, don't worry, I've got it covered. I'm raising up the Babylonians to come and destroy them, as if that makes everything all better. And then Habakkuk says, he's even more perplexed, and he says, God, how can you allow a nation that is more wicked than Judah to come and destroy Judah? How is that a fair response? And God's answer to that, basically, at the end of the day, is that Babylon's time also will come, and Habakkuk just needs to quietly trust him. But this is, I think, one example of a very limited rationale where there are sometimes where God may allow evil in order either to discipline or to punish wickedness. You can see how that's very limited.
Can I pause you there?
Sure.
Wickedness, does it count as wickedness not to worship God? Is that a form of wickedness?
From a biblical perspective, yes, that would be sort of the root of all wickedness. We were designed to worship God, and every dysfunction of humanity comes from our failure to worship God. So,
but again, God is Almighty, and that such a being would care one way or another. I mean, if you had a neighbor who you went out and you saw him on his driveway and he was stomping, and you said, "Well, what are you doing, neighbor?" And he said, "Well, these ants, they're not sufficiently respectful of me, so I'm going to wipe them from the face of the earth." And you can imagine a human doing that because we can be really twisted and warped, but a perfect being caring one way or another. And a good parent doesn't force the children. Well, I don't know. This is a theory of parenting. You do things so that you will be loved, and you don't punish if that doesn't happen. At least I certainly made a point of not parenting in that way. So it's another puzzle. Now, for you, it initially might not seem like a puzzle because you're within the belief system, the Christian belief system. So you're used to thinking in terms of, we are merely God's servants. We must be respectful. We must obey. If you're outside that, it just seems really strange. And again, the only framework I have for doing it is to look around at my fellow human beings. And when I regard them as not perfectly good and everything else, but as fine human specimens, very intelligent, very accomplished, and wishing the best, and I think about what they would do, and then you try to sort of say, okay, now take that to the 10th power, and then you've got what God should do, and yet it seems so unexplainable.
Sure. Well, I understand you're being perplexed at that, and I think the way that you're framing it does set that up to be perplexing. I wouldn't frame God's desire for worship in that way.
Okay.
And I don't think the Bible frames God's desire for worship in that way. So just to kind of quickly respond to that, God does not desire our worship, or he is not upset at our failure to worship because he has a need for worship. I think any theologian who would suggest that God has some sort of emotional need for worship has already failed on several levels to understand what we mean by God as being an infinite being who has no needs, who's self-sufficient. But I would say that God is upset by our failure to worship, not because of a need that he has, but because of a need that we have, and because of his love for us, in that it's really we who need to worship God. And when we fail to worship God, we are doing the most self-destructive thing that we could possibly do. And that sort of implies a certain understanding of what it means to worship anything at all. But I think from a Christian perspective, what we worship and what we most love and what has captured our attention and affection is really what's at the very center of our life and what determines everything that we do. It determines how we emotionally react to life. It determines what we pursue. It determines how we behave. And it really is the core of who we are, is what we worship. And we were created to worship the source of life, who is God. And whenever we replace God with anything in creation and worship a creature rather than the creator, we do the most self-destructive thing we could possibly do.
Okay,
and
self-destructive. How are we hurt?
When
do we get
hurt when we
sick?
worship something other than God?
Right, because there are people in other religions who seem very, very upstanding, very fine human beings, They don't seem to be suffering any particular thing, um, and so it's a puzzle because I can find a whole bunch of counterexamples, and that is people who have never worshipped God, who don't even know God exists, and yet who seem to be thriving as human beings.
Sure. Well, I would actually challenge that assumption. From a within the Christian worldview, our sort of premise would be that every creature, every person who's made in God's image, every person is a worshiper. So even if they don't worship the true God, or maybe they don't worship in any overtly religious way at all, they still do worship. It may not seem like they do. And I would also want to argue that everyone does have knowledge of God to some extent. It's not the case that there's, a person could possibly be completely irreligious and have absolutely no concept of God and no understanding of God. That's probably a rabbit trail, and I totally understand you not wanting to accept that, but I'm just kind of telling you where I'm coming from. But to answer your question in saying, how is it harmful when we worship something other than the true God, I guess to kind of sketch a response to that, I would say that whatever it is that we worship becomes our ultimate standard of truth, value, and meaning. And God is the only real legitimate source of those things. So whenever we turn to something else to tell us what's real, what's meaningful, what matters, it totally breaks any accurate understanding of those things, and it affects the rest of our lives in terms of what we pursue and strive for and value.
Yeah, I agree that there are a lot of people who worship money or who worship fame. They worship something that's going to give them a lot of trouble. But yet there are people who seem remarkably enlightened in what they think in life is of value. And then I have two other thoughts. So one is, do you believe in heaven and hell?
Yes.
Okay, but then so God says you didn't worship me. Why isn't it just enough punishment that okay, you wasted the one life you have because you didn't worship me? So why, after you die, to cast you into hell? And of course, there are different versions that hell can take. Why kick them? They're a loser, and they've already suffered in life because they failed to worship God, and now to beat on them now that they're dead. It's like it's overkill. And another kind of related thought on this is, if you're saying that God is the one true way, right, the one source, the one person to whom that you must revere, then we get to the question of evidence, which, remember, was the second point.
Sure.
So we may have come around to that in the natural course of things. And so there are lots of religions. Allah makes similar claims, except that the way I would worship Allah would be in a dramatically different way than I would worship God. I would have to go through a bunch of different earthly processes to show my reverence for him. And presumably, if I'm making Allah happy, I'm not making God happy. They might be just two different interpretations of the same divine being, but then in which case, well, which way of worshiping is the correct way? So we're led back to that
right.
Consideration.
Well, let's if we do have time, I really would like to look at that.
I've got 15 more minutes.
Okay, great. Thank you. So to respond to what you've said there very quickly on the subject of hell, I think the way that I would approach hell is, and I think this is biblical too. I think there's enough biblical data to suggest that this is the Bible's understanding of hell. There's a lot of things to say about hell, but I think that this is most relevant to what you've said here. And C.S. Lewis put it like this. He said that the doors to hell are locked from the inside. And what he meant by that is that people don't suffer for an eternity in hell because they desire that, they see the error of their ways, and they desire to repent and turn from their self-sufficiency, and they want a second chance, and then God just says, no, you blew it in life, and so you're in hell for eternity. I think that's not a biblical picture of hell. Rather, the picture of hell that the Bible paints is more one of people end up in sort of this eternal torment because they eternally refuse to turn from their self-sufficiency.
Okay. Again, eternal torment, that's about as bad as you can get. Why not simple annihilation on death, where this all ends? And if it was torment, and it's sort of like an eternal second chance at them finally saying, okay, you win, right? And I'm going to worship you now. But that shouldn't be something God wants to do. That he should want to be loved, and he should behave in a way that he is lovable. And that's one interesting difference, at least from my perspective, between Old Testament and New Testament. You go from this vengeful God to this loving God. But hell is just the worst thing you can imagine, and that anybody would be worthy of that. You can even take mass murderers. Take the most evil human beings. I'm not sure that's an appropriate punishment. It's just so awful. And then heaven. Well, heaven has its own problems. As a stoic, I suspect in heaven, people are going to take it for granted, or it's going to be the same old desires that arise of, he got to sit closer to God than I did, and I don't like that.
Well, can I pause you there for just a moment?
Go ahead.
So I read your blog post in the Huffington Post related to that.
I did a kind of a blog for a while.
Yeah, and you had a post about that very issue, about the sort of the tedium of immortality, and I read that, and I think you're describing hell when you are making that description of heaven. That it's sort of this unending eternity of unsatisfied desires because people have not learned how to truly satisfy their desires.
They bring their personalities with them to heaven. And if they don't, is it really them that's going to heaven?
Well, in the Christian faith, I think that's exactly what hell is you bring your personality with you to eternity, and you just eternally disintegrate because of your own dysfunction.
Okay, but if you strip me of my personality, then am I still me?
I don't think that heaven is a stripping you of your personality, but I do think that you lose your dysfunction.
Okay.
And so, but let's leave that there because we do have a limited amount of time.
Okay.
I just want to touch on a few other things.
Sure.
So there is a sort of a bigger theodicy that is worthy of consideration. So the one that I gave sort of a partial theodicy that God may allow some evil in order to discipline or to punish, but that doesn't answer the really big question, which is why would God allow evil into creation to begin with? Sounds like that actually may not be as big of an issue for you because you could allow for some amount of evil. But Aquinas suggested a theodicy that has come to be known as the O Felix Culpa theodicy, which is Latin for O blessed fall. And it sort of begins like this. It begins with the question of asking, why does God do anything at all? And you asked earlier, why did he create it all? And if he is totally self-sufficient, totally satisfied in himself and with himself, why would he do anything at all? And the Bible does have an answer to that. It's sort of consistent that God always acts for his own glory. You may have heard that before.
What is glory?
Well, to say that God always acts for his own glory is to say, glory, I think one way to sum it up is kind of You could say magnificence or splendor, but when we say that God acts for his own glory, what we're saying is that he acts in order to express himself and to reveal himself in all of his glory. So basically, you know, it's almost why any artist does anything. It's not necessarily to glorify themselves, but they're revealing who they are, and they're making a statement, and they're expressing themselves, and they're sort of putting themselves out into the world.
But that makes God, it sounds like an ego problem. You know, if we say that of humans sometimes, there he is in all his glory, right? When you have somebody who is just really, every time they get a chance saying to the world, hey, everybody, look at me, look at how wonderful I am, look at the things
Right.
I've done.
And I would agree with you, and I think that most other religions do have that issue. But in the Christian religion, God is a community of three persons.
Okay.
So, God is the Trinity, which obviously has its own issues, philosophical issues. But what I would say to that is that the Father is always acting to glorify the Son, and the Holy Spirit. The Son is always acting to glorify the Father. So it's actually an outward focused action.
Okay.
Does that make sense? I mean, at least,
It's a hint of where it could go. And see, and a lot of these things, that's all I need is
sure.
a hint. As soon as somebody says, you'll never understand it, that's when I say, well, then, hold on here.
Right. Well, so you can imagine how that could be developed. And Jesus himself said that, in the Gospel of John, he says, everything that I'm doing, I want to show the world who the Father is. And elsewhere in Scripture, it says that the Father created the world for the sake of the Son, to reveal the Son. And so that's sort of a baseline. God always acts for his own glory in order to reveal himself and basically display his magnificence. If that is why God does anything at all, then this does or could shed some light onto why God may have permitted the fall to happen in the first place, and why he may permit evil. And here's the basic suggestion of this theodicy, is that the existence of evil in the world, well, I'll put it this way. A world with no fall and no salvation is altogether less God-glorifying than a world with a tragic fall, but also a wondrous salvation. So what's going on there is that the existence of evil allows for God to act in a redemptive way, to assume humanity, to come as a man, to die on the cross, to redeem sinners, to forgive sin, showing that God is gracious, to judge other sin, showing that God is just. And so the basic suggestion is that we know who God is in a much more glorious and full way than we would if none of that ever would have happened.
Okay, my brain is playing tricks on me again, because now what I'm visualizing is a father, an old wooden house, a bunch of kids, and he knowingly lets the house have defective wiring, because what happens is occasionally a fire will break out, in an electrical plug or whatever, and he'll come rushing in and he'll put it out, and he'll say, look at everybody, I saved you once again. And so that's cool and all. But, you want to say, hey, why not fix the wiring? Or why get a house with bad wiring to begin with?
Sure.
Now, he could say, well, I didn't know it was bad, or I couldn't afford it. God can't say that. So the human excuses are stripped.
Well, to continue with that analogy, in the Christian worldview, God one day will fix the wiring. And in a perfectly redeemed new heavens and new earth, sin, pain, suffering, all of that will be gone. And so, but the suggestion of this theodicy is that what we will have then, our knowledge of God then, and our experience of life then as redeemed people will be so infinitely more valuable because of the fall and salvation that we experienced than had we never experienced any of that.
Infinitely is a whole bunch, right?
Well, how about much more valuable.
Yeah, right. No, but that's the interesting thing, because there's so much evil, there's so much human suffering that it has to be an absolute huge ultimate gain. And then the other problem is, of course, a lot of the people, when it finally happens, they're dead, they're gone, they're in hell. They've had their chance. So, when you talk about what will happen in the future, there are people who won't be bailed out by that. I think.
Well, I understand where you're coming from there. So it's I'm at 55 minutes right now. When you said you had 15 more minutes, we were at
Take 5 more minutes.
okay,
Okay.
5 more minutes. Again, I want to thank you for your time,
Sure.
and thanks for these last 5 minutes. So in our last 5 minutes, rather than moving toward evidence for the Christian faith, because we only have 5 minutes left, I want to do one more thing with the problem of evil, if I can.
Okay.
I think that let me find this in my notes here. I believe that the skeptic, atheist, or agnostic who is troubled by the problem of evil has a problem of evil of their own. And I think that the problem of evil, the presence of evil, can also make a case for God's existence rather than a case against God's existence. So let me put it this way. I would argue that the problem of evil itself only makes sense within the Christian worldview. Or to put it another way,
you need to be. I think it really helps if you are within the Christian view. If you're outside, and that's the thing, because you come in with this assumption about the nature of God, and I don't. For me, it's just one of many possible religious viewpoints. So it's very difficult. And you find me during this conversation, time after time, I lapse back into the human equivalent, and that's where I get into trouble. But in order to avoid doing that, I would have to accept the Christian worldview, in which case you wouldn't need to talk me into anything. So
sure.
That's the snag in having this kind of discussion.
Well, but what I'm saying here, though, is that I think for someone to coherently articulate the problem at all, that even the existence of the problem itself only makes sense within the Christian worldview. And to put it another way, I think in order for an atheist or agnostic to raise the problem of evil, they actually have to assume the existence of God in order to formulate the problem to begin with. And if I can, I'll try to briefly demonstrate why I think that's so.
Okay, it sounds circular, but go ahead.
Okay. So here is it in a nutshell. I would say that the reality of